Hello, you're listening to Wine Blast. I'm Susie Barry, and I'm sitting here not just with my husband and fellow master of wine, Peter Richards, but also a lot of white wine and the remnants of some rather lovely ceviche and risotto.
Yeah, and this
What's
is not
today?
It's not just breakfast. You know, some of the cheeky people out there might be tempted to comment. We do actually have a proper reason for all this sort of carnage, don't we?
Do we? No, we do. In this episode, we're going to dive into New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. Now, it's a sponsored episode with New Zealand wine growers to mark International Sauvignon Blanc Day, which this year falls on the 7th of May.
But to be honest, I think any excuse to do an episode on Sauvignon Blanc is fine by us. I think our regular listeners will know we are massive suckers for Sauvignon, huge champions of the stuff. Although, you know, it can be a controversial grape variety.
Indeed it can, but, you know, frankly, it wouldn't be any fun if it wasn't, would it? Really? Anyway, we'll come back onto that a bit later, but the general plan is to explore the world of Sauvignon Blanc and what it is, where it's grown, and then look at why it's got so popular in New Zealand, how it's evolved there over time, and what today's New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is all about.
Do you think that's enough to justify all these bottles?
Maybe.
Try harder. But important to say, this episode isn't just about us tasting nice bottles and glasses of wine, is it? We have enlisted some expert help. We'll be talking to the hugely experienced James Healey of Cloudy Bay, also formerly of Dog Point, now at Able. We've got Natalie Christensen, head winemaker at Zealand, which is great. We're really excited to have world-renowned scientist and researcher Wendy Parr, also wine merchant and restaurateur extraordinaire Melanie Brown. Wow. We'll be briefly also, in addition to them, talking through some of the very best bottles from our tasting. Looking forward to that. I think the idea is to use them to frame the discussion, is the idea. That implies a bit of organisation, which might not be happening, but that's what the idea is, the rough plan. We're also going to be discussing these delicious food matches too.
Yeah. And finally, by way of a bonus, we'll be giving away 6 bottles of the wines featured in this episode to one lucky UK-based listener. All you have to do is to tell us what your favourite accompaniment to Sauvignon Blanc is. Now, it could be food, but we're thinking not necessarily, maybe music, maybe an occasion, maybe a person.
Be careful what you say next.
Peter Richards, of course.
Thank you.
Not quite.
Do you think my favourite person is Peter Richards?
We'll pick one winner at random from what we think are our favourite entries.
Yeah, there are loads of ways to enter this. You can comment on our social media posts about this episode on, I guess, Instagram and Twitter. You can email us, contact@susieandpeter.com, or you can leave us, of course, a speak pipe message. We love to hear your voice via our website, susieandpeter.com/podcast.
Yeah, and tag New Zealand wine growers in any of your social activity if you're feeling generous. And we're going to run this for a week. Entries will close on Friday the 14th of May, and we'll choose a winner after that. So join in, and you could be drinking in pretty stylish, savvy fashion for quite some time. Well, I suppose that depends on how much you drink or how fast you drink.
Indeed.
A little while.
We will leave that up.
At least an evening.
We'll leave that out there. So talking of loads of wine, you know, I see a glass or two before me, and some food. So probably easiest to say we'll put details of the dishes on the website, but essentially, and I'm going to get corrected here, but I'm going to have a stab at what these are. We've got salmon ceviche.
We have
with tiger's milk.
Tiger's milk, yeah, which is a kind of a sort of a lovely.
It slightly scares me. Doesn't sound very sustainable.
It is indeed, but no, it's the kind. It's the sauce that the citric sauce that you marinate the salmon in.
Sounds easier. And then we got roast monkfish, which I've been tucking into with asparagus risotto and some sort of butter.
Lemon thyme butter.
There you go.
Don't miss that bit out. Lemon thyme.
Whatever lemon thyme is.
Anyway,
beautiful. And then, so we got 3 wines for the first section.
Indeed,
lined up here. They're all from Marlborough.
Yeah.
These 3, and they're all Sauvignons, obviously. We've got Cloudy Bay Sauvignon Blanc 2020.
We had to kick off.
And then we've got a couple of Dog Point wines, haven't we? So Dog Point Sauvignon Blanc 2020, and in the section 94 2018.
Yeah, which is rather special, and we'll talk about that in a second.
We will. So let's start with the Cloudy Bay. This is about £25. £25. Sorry, Majestic Clos 19. Cloudy Bay, famous, historic, iconic, whatever the words would you use.
Well,
Cloudy Bay.
yes, yeah. I mean, it's just sort of the name that everybody knows. I think when you think of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, what is the one name that you think of and have always thought of? Is Cloudy Bay.
But interestingly, the style of the wine is not quite what we were expecting, and not quite what we remembered or associated with Cloudy Bay, because we sort of
we've tasted a lot over the years.
We have tasted a lot of Cloudy Bay over the years, not just their Sauvignon as well, but with this we expect extravagance, opulence.
Well, I've always thought
exotic.
of it as that classic, quite punchy, expressive, gooseberry and passion fruit and all those sort of things. Just an expressive, clean, fresh, zesty New Zealand Sauvignon
What we might term
Blanc,
a Wairau, sort of classic Wairau style.
Yeah.
We will come on to explain that.
Then the different
that in a minute.
style, sub-regional styles.
But it's gone elegant on us, hasn't it?
It has. I mean, it's more restrained. It's in some ways it feels a little bit more safe. It's very very easy to like.
Yeah.
And what we did like, we loved it with the ceviche.
Yeah, where were the food?
You sort of had the fresh and zesty ceviche and then the fresh and zesty wine, and the two together, nothing was battling. They were just
it's
really
not just
lovely.
fresh and zesty, is it? There's some herbal and some interesting
there's some
food
herbal,
notes, but it's definitely less in your face than what we remembered, which is interesting. Maybe that's an evolution thing, and we will talk about the evolution of generally of New Zealand Sauvignon towards those more subtle styles.
The vintage, and that's something we'll talk about later as well.
Yeah. So lots to talk about later. So
dear.
let's come on to the dog points quickly then. This first one, which you've got, which is the dog point straight Sauvignon 2020. That's about £15-18 at Majestic Wine Society specialist sellers. Lots of places.
It's pretty widely available actually. This one, 2020, but we describe this much more as new wave.
It's new wave, isn't it? And by that, we mean sort of. It's not just about fruit. It's not just about herbs. This is more flinty. It's kind of
mineral.
Smoky.
It goes beyond the fruit. It's quite challenging. Let's be honest. If you're thinking of buying this, if you hadn't already tasted it, it's smoky. It's mineral. It's a bit yeasty. It's one to sort of. It's intriguing. We love it. We think it's fantastic, but it's not your classic New Zealand Sauvignon. So you need to go into that purchase and that drinking,
and maybe one for fans of Sancerre or Puy Fumé, all those sort of things, and
but a little bit more.
It's got more. Yeah, it's still got quite an intensity of expression on the palate. Still very tangy, but very flinty as well. I mean, lovely as an aperitif if you don't like that opulent style.
Absolutely. And we've actually then, talking of opulent though, we've got Section 94.
When you say we've got, I've got it. I think
you've got it actually, haven't you?
I'm
Dog
safeguarding this bottle just
so
right
this
here.
This is a special wine, Dog Point Section 94, which is a bit more expensive, isn't it? This is about £26.
The Wine Society, specialist sellers,
New Zealand House of Wine, and then some independents.
It's very opulent, but what's lovely about this is it's not at all sickly or sweet. It's oak aged, but it's savoury. Yeah. It's savoury. It's nutty.
So we're thinking more in the realms of white Burgundy.
There's an element of white Burgundy, even though this is Sauvignon. The oak treatment is brilliant. You still get some of those Sauvignon flavours and the freshness.
But that lovely roasted walnut, beautiful. It's beautiful.
And it didn't go well with the ceviche. It totally overwhelmed the ceviche.
It overwhelmed the ceviche. I mean, some wines do, if they've got that much character. But it was lovely with the risotto, wasn't it?
Yeah,
really good.
And things
really
like fish good.
pie,
anything in that spectrum with this one.
Bit more, weighty, creamy foods.
Beautiful.
So why are we starting here? Well, the reason is that these wines speak to both the history and the evolution, as you can tell, of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, or certainly Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. But we actually wanted to start even further back, right at the beginning on our little adventure, our Sauvignon Blanc adventure, and ask the question, what is Sauvignon Blanc?
Yeah, so okay, that's a good place to start. Let's start at the beginning. Sauvignon is an ancient grape variety. It's thought to have originated in the Loire Valley, which we know from Sancerre and Puy Fumé. It's a descendant of the Pinot family. To be honest, lots of grapes are. But interestingly, it's a parent of the world famous red variety Cabernet Sauvignon. So Great Bordeaux would have been very different were it not for Sauvignon Blanc.
Well, what would those first growths have done?
I know, there we go.
Without Sauvignon Blanc?
The name likely comes from the French sauvage, meaning wild, because the shape of Sauvignon Blanc's leaves is similar to those of the wild grapevine.
Yeah. It's a vigorous vine, which makes equally vigorous wine, actually, all around the world. It tends to thrive in coolish areas, making wines that are typically crisp and fresh, as we've said. They can vary in expression from, stony, flinty, grassy styles in the Loire to richer blends with Semillon in Bordeaux to the maximum expression payload of Marlborough. There it comes and goes, I'm here. Hey, look at me.
Yeah, it's undoubtedly one of the Premier League of international grape varieties. And beyond New Zealand and France, which you've mentioned, it crops up pretty much everywhere there's grapevines. Not necessarily a good thing because often it's planted in places that are too warm, but it's all over the world. I mean, you think of Chile, South Africa, yeah. Where else? California, obviously.
Yeah. Austria, actually.
Yeah, Austria's a good shout in Europe. You don't often think. Australia, of course. Spain, not always
and
successfully.
Italy.
Where else?
Italy.
I mean, Moldova apparently has a significant.
I can't. When we found that out, that was just extraordinary.
India, Japan. I mean, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. And according to Kim Anderson and Signe Nelgen's Wine Grapes publication, which is well worth checking out if you're into this geeky sort of stuff, Sauvignon Blanc is the world's 10th most planted wine grape variety, with about 125,000 hectares. It's also the third most planted white on the planet after Aiden and Chardonnay. Interestingly, it's the fourth biggest climber. See what I've done there?
I got it. I'm with you. I'm not at all lost in figures.
In the international planting charts lately. So only Tempranillo, Cabernet Sauvignon and Syrah have grown more in terms of global plantings in recent years.
I think that's interesting just because they're all red varieties. So Sauvignon is the biggest climber in terms of white varieties
biggest grain
in
white
the world.
variety in the world. That tells you all you need to know about how popular it is and how that's increasing.
Completely, yeah. But let's move beyond the facts and figures. I know you love your facts and figures. What is it? Well, it's a white wine that is relatively common. You find it varies in style according to where it's grown, how it's made, and actually how old it is, which is an interesting one, which we will talk about a bit later. It's a bit of a Marmite variety, and some people love it, other people love to do it down, often for genuine reasons, but I think there can also be more than a bit of snobbishness when it comes to Sauvignon Blanc.
They can.
Its detractors say that it's a bit too easy to understand, a bit too extrovert, not refined enough.
And they say it's not age-worthy and other things, which we don't agree with.
We don't
agree with.
No.
We'll take it on. But what about Sauvignon Blanc in New Zealand? I think this is where the story gets really, really interesting. So we know Sauvignon is an ancient grape variety, but historically, I guess it's fair to say it's kind of tended to keep a relatively low profile. In Bordeaux, Sancerre, Puy-Fumé, these wines are called after the place, not the grape variety Sauvignon Blanc. But all that changed in 1980 when the first Montana Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough was released. This was after some initial plantings and experiments in the 60s and 70s. And it's worth remembering, this is really, really interesting doing the reading for this, that at that time, New Zealand was dominated by just fortified wines and varieties like Müller-Thurgau.
That is unbelievable.
I know we should forget
think where it is today.
How quickly it's changed.
Seriously.
Müller-Thurgau in 1990 was more than a quarter of New Zealand's national vineyard. And it was the biggest producer of New Zealand wine until 1996.
Unbelievable.
You wouldn't have thought
Where
that
was Sauvignon
at all.
Yeah.
Even Marlborough itself had kind of been dismissed as a wine-growing region. No one really rated the South Island for wine in the early days.
That is, again, unbelievable.
Unbelievable. But then this wine came along and it just, I guess it kind of just stopped people in their tracks.
Yeah. And one of the first people who was totally captivated by it was an Australian, actually, not a New Zealander, Australian David Honan of Cape Mentelle in Australia.
You were knocking around recently down under.
I was indeed, a couple of years ago. But he went on, clever man, to establish Cloudy Bay with English-born winemaker Kevin Judd.
Kevin was born in Totten, just down the road from us here in Winchester.
Was he really? I didn't know
lad.
that bit.
Yeah.
He was then brought up in Australia, which is where I think the link with David was, of course. Now, their first vintage of Cloudy Bay was 1985. And as Rebecca Gibb points out in her brilliant book, The Wines of New Zealand, this wasn't the ideal time to start a winery, let's face it. There was a situation of oversupply, a government-sponsored vine pull. Phylloxera had been discovered in Marlborough in 1984. There were discount wars raging in the wine shops. And actually, by 1986, the New Zealand vineyard area had fallen to just 4,500 hectares, which is not very much more than we've got in the UK today.
That is nothing.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? What is there today? I mean, loads, so much more, much more.
Fortune favours the brave.
Yeah.
And also I think it's testament to the excitement generated by those first Sauvignon Blancs that was what came to be replanted after Phylloxera in New Zealand. And today the scene has completely changed. Sauvignon Blanc is the country's most widely planted grape variety. It's got over 25,000 hectares. Mm-hmm. Figures alert, stats alert.
Here he goes.
Sauvignon Blanc makes...
Wait. Here we go.
Sauvignon Blanc makes 72% of all New Zealand wine and 86% of New Zealand's wine exports are Sauvignon Blanc.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of Sauvignon Blanc, about 90% of plantings, is in Marlborough. And it's important to say, Marlborough, which originally was dismissed, represents about 2/3 of all New Zealand wine in total.
Crikey, yeah. And Cloudy Bay, let's go back to Cloudy Bay. Cloudy Bay was, of course, one of, if not the most iconic brands of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc in the early days, hence us wanting to use that as our starting point. And not only the wine, but also someone who was there at the time, which we said, James Healey. Now, James is a highly respected and experienced winemaker who was at Cloudy Bay for 13 years. He then left to set up Dog Point and then more recently moved on to Nelson to help found Abel with his daughter and son-in-law. I mean, it's quite a story, but to go back, James's first vintage as a winemaker in New Zealand was in 1979. So those were the really early days. And I started by simply asking him what it was like back then.
It was just as Sauvignon Blanc in New Zealand was starting just on its very fledgling first steps. And I was working for a winery in Auckland, and we had vineyards down here in the South Island, in Marlborough. And but we got the fruit. We took the fruit. In those days, there was only, I think, maybe one winery in Marlborough. That was Montana in those days. And we took the fruit to Auckland and to a town in the North Island called Gisborne, where there was a winery there as well. And I just couldn't believe, after everything I've experienced with New Zealand grapes, and this was 1981, I couldn't believe how much the fruit intensity of the grapes that came up. And that really sort of hooked me on the idea of coming to the South Island, which I did in 1990.
I mean, you've been in wine over 40 years. I hope you don't mind me saying that.
I feel it.
You were first involved with Corbyn's and then obviously at Cloudy Bay for 13 years. Just going back, what was it like in those really early days of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc?
Initially, I think everybody was just amazed at the intensity of the flavour and the style and the I suppose you call it the typical Marlborough style. I think everybody was just in love with it because it was so new and there was no other wine like it.
And how have things changed since those early days when people, really loved the fresh, upfront, fruity style? How has New Zealand Sauvignon evolved over time, do you think?
I would guess. I think the biggest advances in Sauvignon Blanc here has been in the viticulture. It's been in the vineyard, and there's so much been learned. This is how to train the vines, crop levels, soils, what you can expect flavour-wise from different soils. That's huge. For example, in Marlborough, in the Wairau Valley, in the stony Wairau plains, I guess, the Sauvignon flavour there is, I guess, typically it's very lifted, very passion fruity, and quite tropical. If you go to the southern valleys, you go to somewhere in the Wairau Valley and the southern areas where the soils are not stony, they're clay soils. You still get very intense wines, but they're more citrus in flavour. They're more lemon, lime, grapefruit in that area there. And that's quite distinct when you've been making wine there for a while. You can recognise in sub-regional characters. When you go over the hills south to the Awatere Valley, the wine's equally intense. It's cooler over there. And I guess the wines they're like fresh herbs, but I mean like basil, that kind of, it's very attractive sort of flavour. Most of the wine that you would see, I imagine, would be blended from different vineyards, from different lands. So you don't see the effect of that so much generally. But people that do individual vineyard bottling from different areas, you can see those characteristics a lot more clearly.
Now, if we just look at Dog Point, which was your project before the one that you're involved with now, I mean, you and we're talking about style. You became known, I think, there for making a new wave style of New Zealand Sauvignon. So the straight Dog Point has very much a flinty kind of mineral character rather than that opulent passion fruit gooseberry. And then the Section 94 obviously is oaked with a bit more of a reductive feel, struck match. Can you talk us through that and why that is and how you achieved that and then how people reacted to it in terms of that distinctive Dog Point style?
That type of handling, I think, probably would go back to my interest in Chardonnay from probably the mid-1990s, and also a couple of special wines that I tasted that I just couldn't believe they were so amazing. I started to realise when I was tasting really good Burgundy, and it's virtually exclusively Burgundy. You do see a little bit in some cooler areas in California. One or two people in Australia do it. There was very little of it happening in New Zealand at the time. And that basically is the preparation of the juice prior to fermentation. So what our normal handling of grape juice would always be to harvest the fruit, whether it was hand-picked or machine harvested or whatever, and settle it, chill it a little bit and settle it, okay, and to get all the thick, solid material would sink to the bottom of the tank. When you machine harvest fruit, you get a lot more of, they're called lees, that stuff that falls to the bottom. When you machine harvest fruit, you get a lot of lees because the process of taking the grapes off the vine, the skins are broken and the grape is to a certain extent a bit pulverized on the process. Experimenting with using different levels of solids, it's a bit of a journey, I can tell you. If you can judge that right, and experience allows you to do that, if you can judge that right, you can start to get that a really nice level, depending upon the style of wine you're after. That it's a flinty minerality, and it's also, when it's really successful, it's quite crunchy. It's very attractive, and it's not a fruity thing. Okay, so if you're trying to make a fruity wine, using that sort of technique is probably not a good idea because you'll be competing with the fruit. It's like smothering something with too much oak if you're not careful. And so we're going down that track using not adding yeast, so uninoculated ferments, and experimenting with various levels of solids. And with Chardonnay, I found that you could quite easily just use all of the solids with Chardonnay most years. And it really, really gave the wine a texture and a flavour that, in our minds anyway, improved the wine. It made the wines into a style that we were more pleased with. With Sauvignon, with Section 84, that's what we started doing, because that is some deep clay loam where the Section 94 vineyard is. And so the wine has never been incredibly fruity, but it's always had really great structure, the wine that came off that block. And that's where we started to with Section 94. We didn't use any new barrels. We just used older barrels because we didn't want too much oak, but we wanted to see the effect of the solids and that flinty character in the wine. And we've come a long way with that, and we're very pleased with who we are. Yeah.
Exciting times ahead.
Yes. Thank you, Susie.
So a couple of things to add to that. Firstly, James wrote afterwards to say that the special Burgundies he was talking about were...
Yeah, well, I was interested in this.
I know. I did sort of email him after to say, what were they? Well, they were a Polini Folatière Domaine Le Fleuve 1987.
Nice if you can get it.
Yep, and a Chablis Les Clos 1983 from Domaine Pinson. Wow,
Grand Cru.
Yeah. So he's very excited about the potential for Chardonnay in Nelson, Upper Moutray, and for example, in very much a Chablis style. I think he likes. Be
really interesting to taste.
He really likes
and
that
see
style.
Yeah.
But
he's a master with Chardonnay.
He is. I mean, he really is. His Dog Point Chardonnay is
one of our favourites.
Stunning, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. But not just that. He's planting Albarino and Nebbiolo.
That was fascinating to hear.
So,
we can have a Barolo from Nelson.
Yeah, who knows?
And wonderful Albarino. It sounds really exciting.
I just have to add one of his favourite food matches for Sauvignon Blanc, which is it starts off normal, fresh mussels with some butter and wasabi. Not too much.
Wasn't that? Didn't he mention something about it was inspired by some Japanese friends? Yeah.
I love it. So everybody, if you next time you're doing your mussels, slap in some butter and just a little bit of wasabi. Give it a good stir around.
Not too much.
Little kick,
and that's for your Sauvignon
working
Blanc.
With
that actually really nicely. Okay.
Anyway, let's move on now to taste. We're going to taste and talk through three more wines from a couple of other producers. Again, though, in Marlborough.
Okay, so we got the Zealand's Single Vineyard Sauvignon Blanc from Awatry. We've also got the Brancott Terroir Series Reserve Sauvignon Blanc. It's 2020 as well. And then finally, I think you've got that one, the L5.
I've got the L5
Zealand,
single block
L5
Zealands again. And this is 2019. So we're a little bit, just a slightly older wine.
And I think that shows in the wine as well. But three really interesting wines from a sub-region of Marlborough, Awatry. It's really windy. It's kind of exposed. diurnal variations. It's pretty full on. But anyway, the single vineyard is the Zealand single vineyard Awatry is $13.95 at the Great Wine Company. And I think this is beautiful. This is a really pure expression of Awatry. It's that sort of tomato leaf.
It's very elegant.
Green plum, zingy, citric, but within that context, it sounds sort of almost too green and sour. It's really well balanced.
I think it's very elegant, very elegant. For me, it was one of the sort of not lighter styles, but there was just less concentration
it's just
there.
But it's very
and pure and refined, filigree, isn't it? Really beautiful. Filigree.
Get you. What I'd say is that it went down really well, and it went down really well with the ceviche, particularly, didn't it?
It did. Again, like the Cloudy Bay, when you've got those slightly more elegant, lighter, sort of less expressive styles, but still with the zestiness. The ceviche.
This one for me was more expressive than the Cloudy Bay.
Fair enough,
very much in that certain spectrum. Yeah. But I mean, it did. I would say is this is tangy. What it is tangy. Yeah. If you like your that squeezed lemon on your food, this is the one to go for.
Zealand's makes
slightly errs on that citric side.
Zealand's make about eight Sauvignons, don't they? So there's sort of different.
But obviously they're based in
Awatry.
They're based in Awatry, and they're not all exclusively, but they focus on this area. And
so Brancott Terroir series it was a little bit more smoky. It's in the same territory, but it's more smoky. It's more sort of tomato leaf and pea shoot and a bit of fennel and really quite. I found this quite complex. I think
there's a little bit of Lee's work and a little bit of old oak and stuff involved in this one as well, which I'm not sure there is in the Zealands. I don't know, but there is a bit more roundness here as well as that classic Awatry refreshing herbal style. There's a little bit more richness.
And we should add that Brancott, it's a name you'll see all the time, but it was Montana, which
yes, so that Montana,
they
first
pioneered
Sauvignon Blanc,
the Sauvignon Blanc.
but they had to rename it, I think, because of confusion in America, didn't they? Montana.
Oh, I don't know why that was.
Yeah, the state of Montana. Anyway, so it's renamed, but it was
But this wine went particularly well with both the ceviche and the monk fish.
This was a really good food wine
match.
For 11 quid. A wine that is in really big distribution. You can get it in the UK.
Asda, Morrison's, Tesco, haven't you?
Ocado, Amazon. It's everywhere. It's everywhere.
Seriously.
But it's really, really lovely, smart Sauvignon Blanc, and actually
for
one of the best value probably that we tasted.
I think it was probably one of the best value.
So really, really good.
So then we move on to L5, which is a single block Sauvignon from Zealand's again. This was one of my favourites, definitely. It's certainly less obvious than something like the Brancott, but it's flinty mineral. There's some citrus rind here, but I found it a really foody wine, and we tasted it, and then I've gone back to it quite a few times. I've got it in my glass here now. It was tingling away.
For me, it was almost like a Gruner Veltliner take on Sauvignon Blanc. There was that, it very much played on the vegetal end of the spectrum. Yeah, quite dry, quite flinty. I'm not sure this is for everyone. It's quite grown up. It's maybe potentially a bit too grown up for me.
Probably,
but a really interesting style.
But again, it's $15.95, so it's not one of the expensive ones at all. And it's again at the Great Wine Company. It won the Decanter World Wine Awards in 2020, one of the Best in Show awards.
And of course, we are, a great competition. And I say that
can't say why
with the fact that I judge there. But anyway, to tie in with all of this, we talked to Natalie Christensen, the head winemaker at Zealand's estate in Awatry. Now, she's actually, you knew this, a classically trained musician. Double bass, plays in a band. Lou Reed numbers.
I want to see Natalie playing that double bass.
Wait for this. She's got many strings to her bow.
Oh no, please! Right.
Sorry.
Carry on. Deary me.
I asked her what
Come on, Natalie, help us.
What she finds, Natalie, come in here right now. This is your moment. I asked Natalie what she found most intriguing about Sauvignon Blanc.
I'd have to say probably the pungent aromatics and the zippy. I don't know. You just can't miss New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, and you can't miss Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. It sticks out a mile. It's always a pleasure to taste in the vineyard because it definitely wakes you up. And we've obviously just come out of the harvest period here in New Zealand, and smelling the ferments is always incredibly exciting and incredibly invigorating. But just a beautiful, vibrant, sassy style, and still go.
Sassy, I love that. Can it be too much though? Taking the opposite opinion, you say it's full of character, full of vibrancy. Can that be too much?
Yeah, it can be. It depends sort of what style you're after, but there's obviously quite a diverse range of Sauvignon out of Marlborough, and where we're situated in the Awatiri Valley, we get some quite different styles. So it can be a bit more herbal, a bit more mineral. Some of the aromatics can be slightly more restrained, and it's a bit more of a textural style. But in saying that, we also get pockets of volatile thiols, which are those punchy passion fruit and like grapefruit characters coming through, like the lower Wairau region in the Wairau Valley, like closer to the coast. They can be those really kind of sweaty, cat's pee, tropical, almost like oozing out your pores sort of styles of Sauvignon, which some people love and some people do find a little bit confronting.
So you talk about Awatry, where the winery is based. You have a large vineyard there. It's a sub-region of Marlborough. Perhaps let's start there then. Can you talk to us a little bit about Awatry as a place? More importantly, what it gives to the wines. You've touched on it a little bit, and I'd like to hear you talk a little. You mentioned texture. Perhaps you could elaborate a tiny bit more on that, and also maybe more broadly, the sense of place in Sauvignon Blanc, because we don't often talk about Sauvignon as being different according to where it's grown, but I think we're starting to see that in New Zealand and Marlborough particularly. Maybe you could just talk about that as a slightly broader point too.
The Yeoman's Vineyard is known as Seaview Vineyard, and it's right on the coast in the Awatere Valley, and we get a very distinct style of Sauvignon coming out of that pocket of Marlborough. And being so coastal, we tend to get a lot of moderating sea breezes. So we tend to have a very long growing season. We're about usually 10 days to 2 weeks after the Wairau for picking. So we'll start up a bit later out there. It's very cool and it's very dry. And being so coastal, we get almost like a salty minerality through the wines, and it gives a beautiful texture. It's like crushed oyster shell. It's almost like a chalky, salty deliciousness with aromatically layered with green herbals, but it can get quite, in some of the warmer, more sheltered pockets of the vineyard, it can almost get even into stone fruit characters. So really diverse. And then back to the sub-regionality thing, and you said that people are only starting to see that now. I think Sauvignon Blanc is such an incredible variety because it does show such a sense of place. There's minimal winemaker intervention with Sauvignon, especially when you're making those vibrant Marlborough styles, which are, stainless steel fermented, no oak influence. It's just a pure expression from that site and that season. And you can clearly see site variation and seasonal variation. When you work with Sauvignon and you work in Marlborough, all the different pockets have quite different personalities. So there is definitely sub-regionality and different styles of Marlborough. Of Sauvignon coming through Marlborough.
Is this going to be, the future for New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, ever more diversity of styles, partly driven by that regionality?
Well, potentially. It depends sort of how things go. A lot of blending does happen, and it depends on sort of the size of the blend or sort of what tier people are making their wines into. But a lot of producers do make single vineyard wines and, sub-regional wines to sort of really do an expose of these special pockets and talk about the different characters. There are also a lot of alternative styles out there too, but they're not as, I guess, mainstream as what people expect from Marlborough Sauvignon. People have been making oak styles of Sauvignon for a very long time. And if you're not prepared for it and you sort of have one, you're kind of like, oh, wait a minute, this isn't my vibrant, zippy Marlborough Sauvignon. There's some toasty notes and maybe it's been through malolactic fermentation, so the acidity softened. So it can be quite a different offering. And then there's quite a few people kind of touching on the natural wine movement with skin fermented Sauvignon, minimal intervention, low sulfur wines, and that sort of thing. So people are playing around with alternative styles, and I think you'll see more of that in the future. But I still think it'll be a niche. It won't be massive unless the consumers really get behind it, which they might.
I mean, you do a bit of that, don't you? You do a bit of oak and you do a bit of concrete eggs with your State of Flux Sauvignon, which is a bit into the funkier end of the spectrum. Do you think that's necessary for Sauvignon to be taken a bit more seriously? That it does develop these slightly more niche styles, perhaps, but which are a bit more ambitious and esoteric and a bit different?
Yeah, well, I think Sauvignon is such a versatile variety, and like this year we have. We've just finished harvest summer. It's all fresh in my mind about what we've been up to. But there's different clones within Sauvignon. So there is a clone that is a Bordeaux clone, and it's a little less aromatic than the sort of traditional vibrant Sauvignon clone we generally work with. So we've put that into oak barrel because sometimes I feel like when you have that really vibrant sort of fruity style of Sauvignon intermingled with oak, it can be a bit too much going on. So it's a more of a kind of subtle aromatic, but just a structural, textural style of barrel fermented Sauvignon. And then, with the eggs, for those of you who are listening who don't know about when we talk about eggs, you're like, what the? But basically, there's a fermentation vessel, which is in the shape of an egg, and it holds around about 1,700 litres. So it's about as tall as me and a bit wider than me, thankfully. But yeah, it's heading into winter, so I could expand, who knows. And the whole concept with fermenting in the concrete egg, it's the convection currents that are created during fermentation, and the yeast lees being constantly kind of in suspension and creating a lot of texture and structure. I think Sauvignon, as I said earlier, was it is versatile. It's got beautiful acidity. It's got beautiful aromatics, and it's just playing around with different winemaking techniques to see what other things we can get out of it.
Wonderful. Natalie Christensen, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Now, I also talked with Natalie, we didn't have time to play the whole interview, sadly, but sustainability, which is a massive focus at Zealand.
It really is, isn't it?
Carbon zero since when they opened in 2008. They're big on biodiversity, planting wildflowers, doing wetlands. I think it's one of the biggest solar panel arrays on their winery in New Zealand. They're doing lightweight bottling and stuff like that. So generally take it very seriously. I think it's probably fair to say, we should just mention this point, New Zealand has been really quite proactive on the sustainability front, hasn't it?
Very proactive, I would
as a general
say.
Industry as well.
For example, they've got Sustainable Wine New Zealand, haven't they? Really, really.
They've taken it seriously, and I think as a country at the end of the world, they have to take it seriously because people are worried about, what's the impact on the planet of shipping this wine.
Mm-hmm.
Also with Natalie, we did touch on the 2021 vintage in Marlborough, which of course has just happened.
Looking good.
It's looking good in terms of quality. Apparently, it's quite an early vintage, and you get good intensity of the fruit. But it's really, really down in quantity this year. Apparently, because of frost and drought and dodgy weather at flowering, various reasons. So Natalie selflessly advocated panic buying Sauvignon Blanc right now. We should all be
she kind of would, wouldn't she?
Breaking down the doors of our shops to get back. She kind of would. She has a vested interest there. But I think it's worth mentioning because I think it's possible that prices might well go up.
They may well go up, yes.
Because they've also had issues with not getting labour in due to COVID. So there's
there's various
drums
things
are being beaten
there,
on that front. So I think it's worth just keeping an eye on that. I also thought it was really interesting what you said about regionality and playing around with winemaking, wasn't it? And I think that should tie in with the next
what we do.
Couple of
because we're gonna move to another couple of wines here, which are not in any way, let's have a look at these, not in any way your average New Zealand Sauvignon Blancs. And this time, actually, we are moving out of Marlborough. So we've got here Pegasus Bay. Oh, my goodness. Now, the reason this is not your average, well, for various reasons, it's not your average New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. This is a Sauvignon Semillon blend from 2017. It is so good.
And it's from Canterbury.
Yeah, Canterbury. So North Canterbury, Waipara. It's about £25 New Zealand House of Wine, Must Wines, The Vine King, Hennings.
But it's as soon as you stick your nose in this, it kind of blows you away. And in a very different way. It's kind
very
of
different.
Woolly, lanolin, smoky mineral. I mean, it's very grown up. It's
well, I mean, the minute you look at it, it's lemon gold.
Deep
it's got
colour.
A deep colour. There's a sort of a flintiness to, or like a reductive flintiness, or like a struck match character.
I think you
to
described
the
it
nose.
as like a cross between a Great Grave from Bordeaux and Hunter Semillon.
Something like that.
But also its own character.
Yeah. I mean, what I felt about it, I mean, it made me quite poetic, this, didn't it? Maybe I'd already had a glass or two.
It made you want to say ridiculous things.
Yeah, well, it sort of did, because I sort of felt like the wine was talking to me, and it's so self-assured. It was almost saying, you are going to like me. I am so intriguing. I am so self-assured and complex, and you can't not like me. And I agree with it. It's a really, really classy wine.
I'm just glad that someone's talking to you in that way.
Yeah. And it was good with risotto.
Special. And it was good risotto. I mean, that's your perfect.
That's all I need.
You should just run off with the wine. To be honest. It's better than me. Pegasus Bay, and we also love their Pinot and their other stuff.
We do.
As well.
I mean, Pegasus Bay, great producers. So interesting. If you want something really different, let's just mention that it is 14.5% alcohol, so it's punchy on the alcohol front, but a nice slightly less of it, but take time over it.
Now, talking about something a bit different, this one, we got the Supernatural Sauvignon Blanc. I'm just looking at the label. I'm trying to use hard to read because it's
Blanc.
A hilarious label.
You can't really read it, can you?
No, you can't. It's like a work of art. You've got to. We'll put a photo of this.
So this had a crown cap, didn't it?
It came in a crown cap.
Yeah.
It's a 2018 vintage. And this is about £19 at Vintage Roots, but it's also loads of independents like Valhalla's Goat and Substrata all over the place. It's just
from Hawke's Bay.
Completely different. It is very important to say. This is from Hawke's Bay, so the North Island. East coast of North Island, which is perhaps maybe a little bit better name for Syrah.
Chardonnay.
Even Bordeaux varieties, Cabernet. So it tends to be a bit warmer. And obviously in Hawke's Bay, you tend to get that more tropical end of the spectrum, don't you? But this is not just marked by where it's from, though. This is almost a kind of, how we describe it? It's kind of borderline natural style.
It's an organic wine. I mean, what I felt about this was, you get that sort of, red apple and what else? It's sort of some spices, a sort of apricot, it's like honeyed character that I felt it would. Just talking of food, I thought it would go brilliantly with something like caramelized pork. But what I did feel was I didn't get masses of Sauvignon Blanc character.
No, this is marked by the winemaking and the place, which is it takes it into complete. But in this episode, what we're doing is trying to explore how diverse Sauvignon Blanc is in New Zealand these days. And this is, I think, a really interesting.
It was really
eclectic,
interesting.
It's
so different.
Looks funky as hell.
Yeah,
well worth trying if you want something a little bit different from your Sauvignon. Interestingly, it reminds me. We tried a Kelly Washington Sauvignon Blanc, didn't we?
We did last
last weekend.
Last weekend. Sorry, we did it last year for your article, and then we did it again last weekend. I blocked it.
A week seems like a year, and it had an element of that naturally sort of orange peely, not classically Sauvignon varietal. And I think it's really important that Sauvignon moves beyond just its varietal character, and we are getting these in New Zealand now. But one thing I did want to say with these two wines, Hawke's Bay, Waipara, regionality. We need to talk about regionality.
So New Zealand, New Zealand is so much more than just Marlborough. Yes, Marlborough is 90% of New Zealand's Sauvignon Blanc, but the next biggest is Hawke's Bay, the next biggest region in the North Island, as we've just said. Famous, as we've just said, for Chardonnay, Syrah and Bordeaux varieties. It is a bit warmer. You get more stone fruit Sauvignon Blanc there. So that's a different style. South from there is Wellington or Wairarapa, the region, which is great for Pinot Noir, but Sauvignon does tend to be a bit more subdued there.
Yeah, you do get mainly Pinot territory there, isn't it?
It is really, but you do get Sauvignon. You do get Sauvignon.
Yeah,
and then if you come over to the South Island, Nelson is actually the third most planted area for Sauvignon Blanc. More mineral, more citric styles. You've then got North Canterbury, which, as we said, the Pegasus Bay is from, which is the fourth biggest area, and they're all producing their own styles, aren't they?
Marlborough's the big one, but they are making their styles, and it's really interesting. There's some up in Auckland and Northern now as well, isn't there? But anyway, well worth exploring some other expressions of Sauvignon. I thought at this point it would be interesting to get a bit of scientific perspective on New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And the country is lucky to have one of the most brilliant wine research scientists in Wendy Parr. I've heard her speak a few times and she's absolutely fantastic. Her background is in psychology and wine science, and she specialises in sensory research. How cool is that?
Pretty cool.
She's done a lot of work on New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc over the years. So I started by asking her what makes Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand, and Marlborough in particular, so distinctive from a scientific point of view.
Well, I'll just step back from the science first for 1 minute. I think when it first came on the market, it was just different. Most people knew Sauvignon in terms of Loire, Sancerre, and it just was different. I think people felt that the people who were making it were very brave to have taken it to London in the form it was in as a Sauvignon Blanc. So that's the first thing that attracted attention. But from our research, now talking about the science, it was the particular combination of both green and fruity kinds of notes. And there wasn't a fixed combination, but both were needed. Our research showed up quite quickly when we looked at what people considered a so-called typical Marlborough Sauvignon. So there was this essential green plus fruity combination. And along with that, we also found, and interestingly, for me anyway, it distinguishes other wines that now, like Marlborough Sauvignon, like Chilean wines, for example, it's this freshness, zestiness, a citrus acidity, that kind of thing, so that it just has this, the fruit notes have this freshness, and even the green. So I think that's what made it so distinctive or different first up.
And just to touch on those very specific flavours, just for a second, we're talking, when we talk green, obviously there are lots you can go into, but to mention the key ones, things like boxwood or tomato leaf or that sort of thing.
On that herbaceous end, yes, I think the original Sauvignons, because I'm old enough to have known those, were very grassy green. It was a greenness of really methoxypyrazines and some of the, for those who understand chemistry, the C6 compounds that give this grassy note. But the vegetal notes of pea, asparagus, green bean, when one of those methoxypyrazines gets quite high, they dominated. And it was really when the Awatere Valley part of Marlborough got developed, I think people started to notice more these herbaceous notes, tomato leaf, tomato stalk. The boxwood or the cat pea note was always there, but it can come out in other ways as well, I think, in more in herbaceous ways. Basil, just some of these other notes now that sort of round it out away from just the unripish green notes.
And when we talk about the fruitiness, you also talk about the fruity component being really important. Things like passion fruit.
Yes, well, that's the one that a lot of people identify with, passion fruit. Across the country, in the warmer areas like Hawke's Bay, for example, you get more stone fruit notes, so more white peach, apricot, things like that, even sometimes into the tropical guava spectrum in a really ripe year. But the other fruits, more apple, citrus, so on, in the cooler areas. So the spectrum varies, and it does seem to vary a bit by region, but also vintage. You know, even though the big producers try to blend and have a consistent product for the consumer, so you know there in London what you're going to get in the wine shop. In actual fact, when you look at the different parcels and the single vineyard wines and so on, they're very different across vintages.
But just to come back to something you touched on earlier, preferences. Why do people like this style so much? What does your research indicate here? Apparently, even the French like it.
Yes, well, yes, I've had to do a lot of work with my French colleagues to retain harmony in our groups. But look, I don't think it's rocket science here. It's this distinctiveness. I think the wine just has a personality. Yes, our research has identified what this personality is. I think to me, there are two things when one talks with consumers and even wine professionals. It jumps out of the glass at you. You know, the flavors are there. And so it's got something. And I think a lot of wine consumers in particular, they can feel intimidated in wine in social circles. And with Marlborough Sauvignon, you know what you're getting. They can recognize it at a party, a function, a big wine tasting or whatever. And it gives people confidence. It's quite interesting as a wine. It might not be one of the great wines of the world, in terms of the way most people think about it. But it has its role here because people not only get something out of it, it's accessible. Most consumers in other research we've done, they don't want to work hard on wine all the time. They don't want to have to extract flavors out of a complex Chardonnay or whatever. They actually like Sauvignon because sitting in the sun or an aperitif, it's easy. You get something out of it. So there's that. But I think too, this recognizable aspect of it works for people too. They like to feel confident. They like to they can recognize a wine. They don't get it wrong. Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio or Chardonnay, they're more difficult for inexperienced people. But Marlborough Sauvignon, nobody gets that wrong.
Yes, so moving on a little bit then, has your research indicated how preferences have changed over time, how people's preferences are changing now?
We haven't got a lot of data on this, but having worked with studies for now something like 15 plus years, we've seen in our data that, yes, there are some changes. And I think let's say the most obvious ones are the greenness, the vociferous nature of that almost raw green up front, just in the early wines. That's mellowed. I think the other way too, people are happy now to have a bit more complexity in it, a bit more palate weight, a bit more concentration of fruit, quite separate from talking about the types of styles of development, but still the main variant of stainless steel ferment, whatever. If people get riper fruit, people are more focusing now on reducing crops and fruit concentration. So people are seeking that now, a bit more palate weight, not just all up front. And I think the third thing that we have picked up is the first studies that we looked at this concept of mineral or flinty notes or stony notes. It was definitely a no-no for Marlborough Sauvignon. A wine rated high in minerality was judged low in typicality for Marlborough Sauvignon. Wasn't an ideal Marlborough Sauvignon. But the more recent work we've done, having some mineral character, was now judged positively. So I think the preference has shifted away from just the raw green and big fruit to a bit more in it.
Wendy Parr, thank you very much for your time.
Nice to meet you, and thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Sauvignon Blanc is brilliant from a scientific point of view because there's so much going on in the sort of chemical soup of the wine. Methoxypyrazines, the green notes, the various fruit notes, the thiols, which are sulfur-containing compounds, which can be sort of passion fruit or grapefruit or guava, or sort of almost veering into sweatiness or cat's pee, which is not for everyone. It depends what you like. And all of those can vary a lot
gooseberry bush.
in the wine, which makes it really interesting to study.
And I think it's great that both what we might call minerality and regionality are starting to play their part in New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, as Wendy says. And not just regionality, but sub-regionality. Yeah. We've talked about within Marlborough, Owatry, Wairau, Southern Valleys, and then Moutere in Nelson. You've got Gimblett Gravels in Hawke's Bay, and also terroir is really kind of taking hold. You've got Appellation Marlborough wine, which has been created, AMW, where the
almost
wines
like an appellation.
It is. It's an appellation, where 100% of the grapes have to come from Marlborough. The wines have to be bottled in New Zealand. Yeah. You've got restricted yields. Yeah. So this is a
very
new
much
thing.
like a European style,
like a European style
denomination.
set of regulations. Yeah.
Hopefully it will take hold. I also think Wendy makes a really good point about vintages.
Yes,
which we don't often talk about and consider.
Not in New World.
We should do more.
Yeah.
I suppose it's normal as these places become more important. The terroir becomes more important, so that the vintage has more of an influence in the wines.
And it does in a slightly cooler climate country anyway, doesn't it?
Exactly.
So you're
marginal
always
territories. Totally right. So, for example, 2017 was wetter and cooler in New Zealand. 2018 was a bit warmer, but it did rain at harvest time. 2019 was a really good vintage. A lot of people said it was their best vintage for a long time. It wasn't too hot or cool. 2020 was interesting. It was quite patchy and challenging everywhere, wasn't it? But it was challenging in New Zealand partly because of droughts, but then obviously COVID as well. There was a lot of uncertainty about what was going to be allowed and what wasn't. 2021, from what we're hearing, was quite early and dry,
which
and
we've said, and low yielding.
And obviously everything's different from Sauvignon Blanc to Pinot Noir to Syrah to wherever. But these are topics vintage is something
they're
discuss.
They're worth discussing, aren't they? Yeah. So we're going to move on to a last set of wines now, aren't we? Now, this is a mixed bag. So what we've got here is an older wine, a blush wine, and a lower alcohol wine. Yeah. So they're all Sauvignon, obviously. Yeah. But we just thought we'd mix it up a bit.
Yeah, just some interesting stuff. We were interested to see what else. We haven't got sparkling and sweet, but we got the Brancott Estate Chosen Rose 2010.
So this is Brancott again.
Back to Brancott.
But it's a special wine of theirs, and as you say, it is 2010. So a really different expression of,
my word.
Of New Zealand
again,
Sauvignon.
Like we say, age worthiness. Really good Sauvignons can age really well. We just haven't really put them to the test.
No.
And this is, I thought it was tasting amazing. It's 11 years old.
I think just on that note, should we say, do not buy your average own label supermarket Sauvignon Blanc for about £8 and then stick it away for 10 years somewhere slightly too warm.
Exactly.
One of the
beauties of Sauvignon Blanc is that it is drinkable and you have it young when it's expressive.
Brilliant. But
this one, this one, to give you an idea, this one's about £40. I don't think it's available in the UK at the moment. Certainly not in 2010. But there are more recent vintages. But this is a serious Sauvignon that can age. Yeah. It's been aged a bit in oak. There's lees work. It's it's
just got
wine.
Lots of complexity and intensity, hasn't it? Yeah. I mean, you wrote an article, didn't you, about
I wrote an article specifically on
Sauvignon Blanc.
Aging Sauvignon Blanc. When I was out in New Zealand in 2016 for the Sauvignon Blanc conference, yes, there really is a Sauvignon Blanc conference, isn't it?
I think that was the first year of it, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was. Might be the second or but maybe it was the first. There were specific tastings on older Sauvignons, and they were just fascinating.
Well, I found the same when I went to Sancerre a few years ago. That they gave us loads. The winemakers there were so keen to give us older vintages, and they were really interesting.
And this is something we've really looked into. I mean, we've tasted Sauvignons from the 70s and the 80s, and they are just, the good ones. Can be. They're not always.
So from the sublime to the ridiculous, we've gone for something. Our second wine here is not ridiculous. It's lovely, actually. It's a blush.
That's very
wine.
Unfair.
I know. I'm joking.
You're just
because it's got blush written on it.
And also, to be honest, the packaging
is terrible.
Well, it kind of looks a bit like a scented candle. But once you get beyond that, the Villa Maria.
You think I'm mean?
Villa Maria Blush Sauvignon Blanc. What vintage is this? 2020.
It's 2020.
It's £12 in major supermarkets. And I have to say that blush is not our natural habitat either.
I kind of wish it said. Did just say rosé?
Because blush, the wine itself.
I don't know what everybody thinks about the word blush.
I can be misleading. You kind of almost expect it to be sort of sweet.
But Zinfandel. I think what you're going to say, the wine is interesting. It's blended. Really it's Sauvignon blended with Merlot, which is Sauvignon really
with a touch of Merlot. Yeah. But it's almost like a sort of New Zealand take on Provence. It's dry. It's herbal. It's earthy.
There was
elegant.
A certain kind of smokiness about it that I wasn't entirely sure. But I just thought, gosh, it is interesting. It's definitely interesting.
Subtle, and it's
quite serious. Yeah.
And you've got that lovely fresh acidity. That's what marks it apart from something like Provence.
Absolutely, There's the Sauvignon,
and you get a bit
acidity.
of crunchy. Exactly. So I thought that was really interesting. If you want a summer drinking rosé, £12. Yeah. Good value.
Really nice. And not surprising, Villa Maria do a good job regularly.
And then the last one we got is the Doctor's Sauvignon Blanc
2020.
9.5% alcohol.
So we are in much lower territory. I mean, obviously it's not low and it's not no, but it is lower. So if you want something in the summer that you're thinking, I really don't want loads of alcohol, I want to have a couple of glasses of something just a bit lower, this is really nice. Really, you're never going to get the same intensity of flavour that you would from maybe a 12 or 13% alcohol Sauvignon, but you've still got all the flavours, and it's dry and it's really drinkable.
And it's typical. I mean, I was talking with John Forrest, who makes this, who's behind it, and he's really interesting guy. He's done all these experiments to naturally lower alcohol. We've obviously been doing a lot of tasting of no and low alcohol wines, but this is a lovely one. Apparently 1 in 3 of us are thinking of moderating our alcohol, trying to moderate our alcohol intake. So
keep thinking about it.
Looking for
Doesn't
lower
really
alcohol.
Happen.
Well, we do as well, though. We don't go for the kind of big alcohol.
Joking.
So I think it is, and he's developed this really interesting technique. He's got quite a scientific brain of lowering their alcohol naturally by actually adjusting the sort of selective leaf removal. So the idea being that the leaves
in the vineyard,
the leaves of the vine are the factories of sugar for the grapes. They're what the photosynthesis is making the sugar. So if you reduce certain leaves in certain areas of the plants, they've done lots of experiments, you can make its ripening curve is slower. The sugar accumulation is
get the
so you
ripeness.
can get ripeness, but at a lower sugar level. It's really, really interesting. And they do a few things in the winery as well. But in terms of making a kind of lower alcohol wine a bit more naturally,
it's very successful, isn't it?
And I think you get the quality comes through in the wine. It's definitely a more linear. I mean, it almost tastes like an early harvest style, doesn't it? It's not your exotic passion fruity,
but it's so drinkable.
It's almost quite Loire in style, kind of like a Minitou Salon.
And it's also very available. So it's available in most supermarkets. And it's about £9. Anyway, finally, we wanted to hear the views of someone who sells New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. So our last interviewee is a wine merchant and restaurateur, Melanie Brown, of Specialist Cellars, an online New World wine merchant, and Brixton restaurant The Laundry. And I asked her why Sauvignon Blanc has proved so popular.
I think New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc has personality. I mean, there's so much that contributes to the success. I think it has a lot to do with the industry, New Zealand itself. I think they've done an exceptional job of being able to kind of retain the rock star status that we know and love for Sauvignon. They've managed to consistently produce a style that's captivating, but of an exceptional quality as well. So I think it has a lot to do with both the terroir of New Zealand and particularly Marlborough, being able to sustain that across the world. But also the industry as a whole, that they work together, they share ideas, they share research, and I think ultimately that's a testament to its success.
So, and you've been selling New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc to British punters for a while, both in retail and now also in a bistro setting. Does it work equally well in both?
I think absolutely. Firstly, with our online retailer specialist sellers, Sauvignon Blanc is our top white wine seller above everything else. And I think, again, that's testament to how wonderful New Zealand produces Sauvignon and the consistency of style. Chardonnay is quickly becoming the second most bestseller at specialist sellers, but equally in our bistro setting at the Laundry restaurant, I think, our punters really understand the quality of Sauvignon. So to see a New Zealand Sauvignon on the list is something that punters equally grab onto as fast as they can. And I think we're seeing when we've got a pick pool and a Sauvignon side by side at the same price point, both are equally flying out the door.
Now, talking about the bistro setting, you've got a culinary background. You were a chef, and then you worked with Raymond Blanc, with Peter Gordon, one of my heroes, Jamie Oliver. What are your top tips when it comes to matching Sauvignon Blanc to food? And do you have a particular favourite match?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So the burrata salad that we have on our menu at the Laundry is the perfect match, because that crisp, fresh, vibrant acidity that we get with New Zealand Sauvignon perfectly matches the burrata and the bistro style setting that we have here.
Now, talking about the style of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, how would you describe the evolution over time? We've sort of seen it changing probably for the last 40 years or so, but how would you sum that up?
I think it's been a really interesting evolution, actually, because, when Sauvignon Blanc landed over here, it was full on, it was very savory, it was very kind of in your face. And I think over time that evolution has slowly mellowed out a little bit. With the style that's coming out of New Zealand. It's a little bit more refined now. It's a little bit more tropical in its nature. And I think, the public here in the UK really have loved watching that evolution happen over time. And, we're starting to see some really interesting examples of barrel fermented Sauvignon Blancs, but equally we're starting to see Sauvignons that are aging. So when we were at the Sauvignon Blanc conference a few years ago, we were seeing Sauvignons that were kind of 10, 12 years old. And that's a really interesting concept for the UK consumers, because we don't necessarily see Sauvignon up here that's that old, but to see a consistent quality wine that can age very gracefully and produce some really interesting aromas is really, again, testament to the producers in New Zealand.
Melanie Brown, thank you so much for your time.
No worries. Thank you, Susie.
So good to see Mel picking up on the age-worthiness of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, which is something we've touched on, isn't it? It does, and it can, and it just adds to the mix, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I also love the idea of Sauvignon Blanc as a rock star.
Ah, yeah, rock
but
star.
Which one?
Mel's a rock star as well, isn't she?
Who do you have?
What if Sauvignon Blanc could be a rock star?
Show our age. Bruce Springsteen.
Could it be Springsteen? Could it be Elton John?
What about Mick Jagger, though? A bit more lively.
Jagger. Beyonce.
Ed Sheeran.
Nice.
Yeah.
Billie Eilish for the youth. But Stormzy.
Sauvignon Z.
Nice.
Oh dear, that's terrible.
Yes.
Terrible.
We could go on forever, but we probably should stop.
We should stop. We should not go on forever.
Send us your ideas. You guys are good at this. Send us, what if Sauvignon Blanc were a rock star? Which one would it be?
Who would it be?
Answer on a postcard.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Anyway, right, to summarise.
Yes, summarise,
because we've done a lot in this. We've talked about a lot in this episode. I'm going to do the facts this time, okay? My turn.
Yep.
So Sauvignon Blanc makes up 72% of New Zealand wine and 86% of its exports. New Zealand is much more than Sauvignon Blanc, just Sauvignon Blanc. We've got Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Syrah, Cabernet, Riesling, Pinot Gris. Yeah. But Sauvignon Blanc is a great prism via which to kind of understand New Zealand, which we've hopefully helped you to do in this episode.
Prism. And there isn't just one Sauvignon Blanc either. Diversity is huge in New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. There's a huge range. When we were doing this episode, before, someone wrote to me on Twitter saying, "Oh, all New Zealand Sauvignon Blancs are the same. It's identikit stuff." And you think, No, I couldn't disagree more. There might be one style it's recognised for, but these days, actually, you start tasting, you see there's a whole world there. So, and we didn't, as I said, we didn't even get started on the fizz or the sweet stuff or whatever, because there's all kinds of styles emerging.
Yeah, more to come, isn't there? Yes, yeah.
I think, it's fair to say, really important context. This New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc adventure has only been going for 40, 50 years, which is a blink of an eye in wine terms. So, I think what we can expect is just more of the same, experimenting with winemaking, viticulture, regionality, vintages. What I think it's really hard to say is you just don't like it. So to say I don't like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is not very tenable.
No, because there are just so many different styles. And what I love about it, an additional thing, is the fact that it's just so good with food. As we said, we made ceviche and risotto, but loads of other things will go with New Zealand Sauvignon. A mild curry, goat's cheese. As Mel said to me, burrata. Why not? She when we asked her, why not?
That was slightly surprising, wasn't it? But I know. I really want to try that.
But I could imagine maybe a burrata with some sort of grapefruit or orange or something like that in a salad would be delicious.
Curry.
But well, I said curry.
No, you did, but I was just saying I vote Sauvignon Blanc with
just
curry.
Just
awesome.
curry.
But is it, I think it's fair to say equally, it's still a bit of a Marmite.
It's a bit of a Marmite. But, let's be honest, whether it's Marmite or not, it is not going away. And there are, as we've said, so many different styles emerging. There is no real room for snobbishness.
No, don't be snobby, people. Sauvignon Blanc can be age-worthy. So don't be afraid to keep the good ones. Just a few years if you're interested in those sort of flavours.
And just as a final point, I know we were joking about it, but there could be a shortage if New Zealand's 2021 harvest is very short, very low, very small. Then it might be worth looking right now and stocking up. Yeah.
So
we have no idea, but it makes sense.
I think the worry is that prices will go up, to be honest. But prices, stock is for all these wines are on the show notes. So here's to Sauvignon Blanc and to New Zealand. Don't forget to get your thinking caps on about what your favourite accompaniment to Sauvignon Blanc is. As we said, it could be food, music, occasion, person. Say no more. Send us in your shouts before Friday the 14th of May, and you can win 6 of the delicious Sauvignon Blancs that we have featured and mentioned in this show. How cool is that?
It is indeed. Thanks to James Healey, to Wendy Parr, Mel Brown and Natalie Christensen. Also to New Zealand Wine Growers for sponsoring this episode, which we really hope you've enjoyed. All the wine details, as we said, and the recipes are on the show notes. So until next time, cheers.